Thank you. going to be yours. Yep. You are, Tom, you're here.
Good evening, everybody. Please take your seats. We'll get started. So welcome. Welcome to the Center for Architecture. I'm Ben Prosky, Executive Director of the Center for Architecture and AIA New York. And it is so wonderful to see people back here and see you sitting here at the center. This reopening is so exciting, partially because it's the Building Congress's centennial, and we did not do all the work of this incredible exhibition on the walls. The Building Congress did. And this is about the friendliest takeover you could ever imagine, totally in cahoots with my friend over here. But it's really appropriate. It's really appropriate because to see what the Building Congress has done, which the Building Congress members are our members, we do this together. It's so impressive and it's so well done, and it really just shows us the vitality and resilience of New York, right? And that we've definitely got more than another 100 years in our organization here. But I think it was the perfect time to celebrate this. And, you know, I always remind AIA, you know, we're a member of the Building Congress, right? I mean, the Building Congress encompasses all these building trades in an important way. I have to say that before I started here at AIA New York, I wasn't as aware of the Building Congress. There's a great legacy. I was quickly made aware. But Carlo, since he's been here at the Building Congress, has done an unbelievable job in pulling together our industry. And even throughout the pandemic, Carlo got us to all pen letters, right, about how we had to keep working. And one of the most heartening things that we did together was a letter to the mayor that all of the labor unions and construction and we're all saying, if design stops during this pandemic, nobody has work later. And everyone depends on all this. And so for the architects, they're like, we feel seen, right? But it was all about us working together, right? So I think that I just want to congratulate you all and say it's such an honor to have you all here. And I think with that, I will pass it to Carlos Chisora.
So Ben, thank you. You said it perfectly. What we build, the theme of our centennial, everyone in here helps build and contributes to this amazing city and takes us from the past 100 years to the next 100 years. We're thrilled to be hosting this amazing symposium today, this discussion. I want to thank the AIA and Ben and the whole crew, but especially I want to thank the New York Building Congress staff for doing such an amazing job here. Absolutely, please, round of applause. Please take your time to walk through and really absorb this amazing exhibit. There's a lot on the walls here, and it's like top floor past, present, the middle, and pandemic. This bottom floor really tells you where we're going, and I think really exemplifies how we are the heartbeat, really, of New York City, New York State, and certainly beyond. Thank you, Carlo.
So I also want to echo thank you to the team, Janine Badalamenti, who's running the whole entire centennial, Michael Papanakis, Terrence Cullen, thank you for all that you do. We are very excited. We, a few months ago, didn't know if we were going to pull off a centennial this year, but we are pulling off a centennial this year. in person, clearly with, safety and everything. That's why we put out a lot of chairs, so if you want to spread out, feel free. But we kicked off our exhibit last week, and we've got some amazing compliments. And it really tells the story of New York. And, for all of us in the world we live in, oftentimes the story of New York is told by buildings, by brick and mortar. And oftentimes brick and mortar gets yelled at, and infrastructure gets yelled at, even though it's supposed to be things that are helping people. So the goal of our centennial was to showcase the past, as Liz says, talk about today, but really look to tomorrow. And down here you'll see a little bit about what we're talking about tomorrow. We have some board members here, former board chair, Tom Scarichello, thank you for being here. Lynn Brown, obviously the mayor of Greenwich Village, who has, I think, Lynn, you single-handedly transformed higher education in New York City, and I really believe that. So thank you for all that you do. And my missing board members, who am I missing? Oh, how could we forget Jill Lerner from KPF, who helped put this panel together for us. Jill, thank you. Who am I missing? Raise your hand. Oh, Robert Salsa, who I said has some great quotes in our book. So thank you. We've got, tonight, we've got a young professionals group getting together Friday to hear from Patty Filippo, Executive Vice President at Turner. We've got our Centennial Ball at Javits, November 18th, a breakfast on October 14th, a documentary on WABC on December 5th that talks about the history of building New York. And then you will all receive at the end of the year our, how many pages? 350? 340 page, 360, 340? 343. All right, something like that. Book chronicling the story of New York. Tonight you're in for a treat. I am not going to take Mitchell's thunder and introduce the folks up here, but they have each, at least over the last few decades, played a critical role in reshaping the landscape of New York in very different ways, and I've worked with all of them, and it's a good mix that you're going to hear from tonight. So I thank you all for participating. And I like to say there are a lot of people running for mayor, there's going to be a lot of people running for governor, a lot of people running for city council, but there's really only one Mitchell Moss. Yes. So I'm going to turn it over to the king himself, and I thank you, Mitchell, for all that you do for New York and for the civic world that we live in. Thank you. Enjoy the evening.
Thank you, Carlo. I just want to say first that Carlo and Janine Lamente have done a great job organizing this, and I had not seen the exhibit till today. I can't wait till it's a book. I really want to say it's just spectacular. It's better than even you described. I also want to say, in the Catholic Church, when you go to another archdiocese, you pay homage to the resident Monsignor, the leader of the church. And so Lynn Brown is here. Lynn Brown has been the force for NYU. We've had 4 people who call themselves president, while she's been the executive vice president for government and community affairs. Now, each one of them thinks they're running the place, but Lynn is the one who's been responsible for anything good that has been added to the city's physical infrastructure. Whatever ugly buildings or bad buildings, the presidents get blamed for. So, now, we have a terrific panel. I just want to say they've been great because they're going to make sure that we have time for questions and answers. Let me just say, you know who they are, but Gene Kohn, it's not just that he's the founder of Kohn, Pedersen, Fox. There's a whole pavilion named after him here. But he took Vanderbilt Avenue, and I think this is correct, which I thought was the darkest, bleakest corner on 42nd, and turned it into a magical kingdom of light because of one Vanderbilt. And if you haven't seen it, you can see how a building can transform an entire part of the city. And because he built one Vanderbilt, every other developer is now saying, I want to fix my building up. Even the Rudins are going to change their building on on Madison Avenue. So you should know that he did it, and now 5 different developers are saying if it's good enough for Gene Kohn, we can figure out a way to do it. So it's delightful to have Gene here. We then have Elizabeth Goldstein, as you may know, is the head of the Municipal Art Society. She was head of the California State Parks Foundation for a decade and had been in New York in the City Department of Parks before then. Tom Wright, of the head of the Regional Plan Association. And the fourth regional plan was a visionary document because it called for climate change policies before we ever heard of climate change. And then I want to say I'm really pleased that Richard Tomasetti is here. As you may know, he's the founder of Thornton Tomasetti. Richard was deeply involved in both the engineering for the World Trade Center and in the entire recovery effort with others. And I think there's no one who knows more about how technology and architecture have merged over the past century than Richard. So we have a great panel. And the best part is that I don't have a job because they're so much better, and they're going to keep this going. But Gene has done more than any of us, prepared a slide presentation. And I thought we would give us a quick, crisp history of how buildings and development have evolved in New York over the past century, coinciding with the Building Congress's century. Gene?
First of all, I'm embarrassed because I have to apologize. I left my hearing aids home, so I don't hear without them. So I'm going to need my questions repeated or speak loudly. So I'm embarrassed to tell you that, but I can still talk. Okay. And it's a very good panel. Thank you, Mitchell. Yeah. So I'm going to do an unusual kind of talk this evening. Starting by saying that on July 4th, 1976, in one of the worst economies the U.S. had, we started Kohn, Pedersen, Fox. The reason I mention that is because there was no work. And with a bad economy, no demand, there was no projects to design. And yet we took the gamble to start a firm at that time, and glad we did, because things did turn around eventually and work out great. But bad times do affect development. Developers don't develop when there's a poor economy, the stock market's down, or interest rates are very high, et cetera. Or if there's a war, any number of things can prevent development and prevent architects from having an opportunity to design the buildings and hopefully build a strong firm and a career. So what I'm going to do tonight is just trace those moments that were good and not so good through history and what took place after. Because some of the greatest buildings in New York were built right after the worst of times. So in fact, it wasn't all bad. So with that, there'll be a PowerPoint, and when there's questions, I may have somebody else catch them and re-recite them to me. I apologize.
We're going to go.
Okay, this chart shows, and a big surprise, that in the first, from 1900 to 1930, an enormous amount of development took place. The Depression was bad in 1930. The economy, and yet New York sprung up with 344,000 square feet of development in the year 1920 to 1930. And so those 10-year periods show major kinds of development. And if you look below that in 1930 to 1940, very little development. Or from 1950 to 1960, very little. That's 36,000 square feet. That's nothing. And very little development. So the economy does vary, and that affects the development of buildings and the form of the city. And you can see some of those totals. From 1900 to 1930, 1.161 million square feet were built in New York. And 1930 to 1980, over 200 million. So it's a rather interesting chart. Next, please. Now, the economy usually is reflected in the stock market, and in a way, it looks like the New York skyline. Not below gray, but above gray in the green. But anyway, that was the Dow Jones from 25 to 2020, and you can see those ups and downs. And if I put the other chart back, you'd see when things were green, development was taking place, and when they were red, they were not. Next. Okay, the skyline of New York back in 1929. Rather interesting. And here's some of the great buildings that were built in those early 1900s. From the Singer Building and the Metropolitan Life Tower, Woolworth and Manhattan Company, all these wonderful buildings that became part of history of New York were built in that period of time. So from the early 1900s up to about 1930, this was taking place. Next. From 1930 on to 1936, you see, Again, some of the most outstanding buildings, the Chrysler Building, Empire State, Rockefeller Center, Waldorf Astoria Hotel, the Federal Courthouse, all built in that period, making major contributions to the city of New York. In 1951 and 1970, this is a drawing showing the existing buildings in gray and proposed or buildings to be developed in yellow. And you see the enormous amount of development that was going to take place over that period of time, and did take place up into the 1970s, particularly in Midtown. Tremendous amount of development took place at that time. And these are some of the great buildings that were produced in that period. Some of my favorites, the Lever House by Skidmore and Romero, Seagram Building in 1958 by the Mies van der Rohe, Chase Manhattan, Gordon Bunshaft, the Pan America Building by Walter Gropius, Emery Roth, etc., and Belusky, and the UN Building by Oscar Niemeyer, Corbusier, and Wallace Harrison. These are still outstanding and famous buildings in New York, but they were built in also a time that was not particularly great, but still better than the 1930s. Next. Moving into the 70s. In the 70s had some good and bad moments, but you saw the World Trade Center towers, the two by Yamasaki built, Citicorp, AT&T building by Philip Johnson, 60 Wall Street, Condé Nast Tower, all outstanding buildings that still today exist or have been remodeled in some respects, or in the case of World Trade, unfortunately, not with us. In 2000 to 2020, a lot of interesting and very exciting buildings were done. One Bryant Park, World Trade Center's new building by Skidmore, Hudson Yards, KPF played a big role in that. One Vanderbilt by KPF. All, again, buildings that are playing a major role in the development of the city and the image of the city. Next. Okay, these, what I'm showing you here in yellow is the proposed buildings, in many cases not built yet, that will be built. Many of the pencil buildings, so the very thin ones, will change the skyline of New York. It already has. If you were to take a photograph from the park to the south, you would see pretty much what those yellow buildings start to look like. Those very thin towers going up to great heights. It's a change in the city where the residential building has become the tallest building. In that case, the most important building in the skyline. And the office building used to dominate, but now you see these giant residential buildings, 50, 60, 80, 90 stories tall, taking over the skyline. Next. I guess that's not right. Anyway, what I was going to tell you, in John, go back to 19, excuse me, 80s and 90s, John. Oh, there you go. Can we go back? It's too late. I guess we can't. I meant to tell you this story. I'm a member of the ULI, and in 1985, at a conference in San Francisco, the ULI said that if you do not go global by 1990, you'll be out of business. I took them seriously. We did. We went to Europe and Asia, and it was true because very little was built. Go back to the. Can I go back to the first slide? No? I'll just take 1 second. Right here. If you look at that slide, in 1990 there, that whole period, very little got built in 1990. In fact, a lot of people went out of business in 1990. So that was an absolutely correct prediction. We did go to Europe and Asia, and it helped keep KPF as a strong firm to this day. So, okay. Anyway, that was just some interesting look at the market and the demand. And I hope that the economy stays strong and the demand stays strong, so we all do well. Thank you.
What you got in about under 10 minutes. So I want to thank you for competing with everybody in higher education. I'm going to ask Richard Tomasetti to talk about the way in which technological change and architecture have advanced and kind of merged their interests together over the past decades, especially in New York, and how that has affected the skyline of New York. Well, I can't think of a more appropriate topic, building off Gene Cohn's point, because he shows you how much the height of New York has continued to be a big part, but what that height consists of and how it looks is quite different. So, Richard?
Thank you, Mitchell. Can everyone hear me? Good. I was just reminiscing as I was coming over here with my new injury for trying to do some work on my own house. Remembering the last time I had the pleasure of speaking here, and I said to myself in the car, I said, I bet they still have those damn stools we have to sit on. So be encouraged, there are things that are constant in life. Not everything's changing. But as I start my remarks, I'd like you to keep in mind the last slide that Gene showed in his excellent presentation, seeing all those very tall, slender buildings. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we got to that, all right? So over the last 60 years, there's been tremendous advances in the integration of engineering and architecture, and in construction materials and technology, and which have affected the size and the slenderness of our buildings, redefining the skyline here in New York. Let's talk about some examples. For example, in the 60s and the 70s, using 5,000 or 7,000 PSI concrete was considered a very big thing, all right? And now we're using 12 to 14,000 PSI concrete, very strong concrete. But what many people may not realize is that with the strength of concrete, which is used often in residential buildings, notice Gene pointed out how many of those tall buildings are residential now. With the strength of concrete increasing in use, the stiffness of the building also increases. So this helps reduce the vibrations and the accelerations, which make people uncomfortable, which often govern the design. Also, with the concrete, you have a certain amount of additional damping that comes in, which also attenuates these vibrations. So what you're seeing is more and more very tall buildings being done in concrete and less in steel. But to the rescue of steel, because they tend to vibrate more, we had the technological continuing development of tuned mass dampers. And these tuned mass dampers, think of it as a little weight up on the top that swings in the opposite direction of the building and attenuates those things, still making steel competitive with the concrete. But that said, only 9% of the buildings that have been built, high-rise buildings, over the last 20 years globally, are now steel buildings. Most of them are concrete or concrete composite buildings. And globally, many of those buildings have been designed and built by architects, engineers, and construction managers from guess what? From New York City. So not only our business here is affecting what New York City looks like, but it's really affecting what the world looks like. Also, we gotta remember, as we sit down and look at our pretty pictures and drawings, the construction of these buildings. The advances in technology to construct these buildings are fantastic. Just picture someone gives you the problem, can you pump this concrete up 1,000 feet to the top of this building? Just think about solving that problem. Tremendous credit has to be given to our construction managers and our subcontractors who actually do all that work. So It's also important to note that nothing keeps us from building in this city. Absolutely nothing, all right? If you look at the old argument, we're running out of land, we just create land. Look at Battery Park, okay? Battery Park, the landfill and putting in the piles, we created land. More currently, you have the Hudson Yards. 81 acres of land, 28 acres of land being developed with tremendous platforms structurally holding up that area. Get ready, soon, the master plan just came out for Sunnyside Yards in Queens. About 180 acres are being developed by using structural platforms over railways. So nothing really keeps us from building. But if we think this is so innovative, I just want to remind you, if you go back to 1913, what was done on Park Avenue between the Waldorf Astoria and the Grand Central Station. Waldorf Astoria wasn't there yet, but all of the platform work that developed land over the Park Avenue subways, which again shows we created land very early on. We know how to do it, and we're still doing it. So with that, I just want to end my initial comments by reminding you that all of this that we create, we also take care of. I got a call many years ago, I don't want to say how many, I got a call many years ago from a developer who was looking at buying the Empire State Building. And he said to me, how long can that building last? And I said to him, with proper maintenance, forever. And I mean that. That building, we renovated that entire building along with many other architects and engineers, replaced 6,000 windows on that building, and replaced limestone that was failing. And then similar work was done on the Chrysler building, so on and so forth. We keep our treasured buildings here, and we keep them going. Thank you, Landmarks, for helping us out with some of that, okay? So anyway, if you look at the architecture, the integration of engineering and architecture, the shaping of buildings so they feel less wind, that's how we come to this very new skyline with these very, very thin buildings, which some people love and some people hate. And I'll end on that note.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. I just want to say, we're living we're here in this building, which is a great example of how American Institute of Architects took this spectacular site and turned it into kind of amazing palace for people to meet and talk. And the invention of having the light coming in from the sidewalk down here is one of the great successes. I have to be careful what I say about the local area here, but this is one of the gems on this corridor here. And if you want to see it, there's so many to the south of us. I always go to the post office at the corner of Prince Street, where Apple Computers told us that they've taken a place where you went to mail a letter, and now you can go in and buy every kind of information technology, taking a dark, post office, turning into a kind of a great place for learning about computers, and no place can move money faster than an Apple store. You give them your card, they give you a $500 watch in the size of about 3 by 5 bucks, and you feel good even if you don't know how to work it. Now let me go to Elizabeth Goldstein, because I think I'd like to have Elizabeth talk about the open space, the space that is just as important as the built environment in terms of structures, but how it's changed and how it's changed how we use it.
Yes, and you'll all be relieved that I'm not going to talk about super talls. I'm the antithesis speaker tonight, and I am indeed going to talk extremely briefly about open space and the trends in parks and open space in New York really over the last 40 years, and really since the 80s, because I think that our open space and park system has transformed in New York City in that time. And I'm just going to give you a super brief tour of the kind of categories of that work and the changes that it's represented. We can talk at greater length if you're interested in talking about this. So one thing that we did in New York, which was really led the nation, as we often do, is we restored some of our most glorious historic landscapes. Central Park, Prospect Park, those were places which in the 1980s, the late 70s, were really down on their heels. They were really places that were losing it. And New Yorkers came together and found a way, often outside governmental intervention, to restore those landscapes and create incredible gems of them again. And we've led the nation in this kind of restoration work. We've also expanded the numbers of parks that we have across the city very, very substantially, especially on the waterfront. And someone just mentioned, I think Richard just mentioned, the parks of Battery Park City, because they were, Sandy Fruscia used to talk about the parks of Battery Park City as the soul of that development, and I think they really are. And obviously the Hudson River Park follows suit, but all over the city of New York, we've been opening up the waterfront to people and recreation and the opportunity to breathe at the edge of the city. Hunters Point South in Long Island City is another incredible example of that. We've also led the nation in reclaiming infrastructure that was used for something else and not destroying it, but actually transforming it. And obviously the High Line is the most extraordinary example of that. Again, a trend-setting thing that happened in New York and is now being followed across the country. But I also want to talk to you about one of my precious projects. I worked on Riverbank State Park, which is a 28-acre extraordinary recreation facility on top of a sewage treatment plant in West Harlem. Who would have thought? The other 11 in the world at the time were all in Japan. So we were doing something extraordinary. We've also reclaimed some of our most extraordinary natural lands. And Pelham Bay, Jamaica Bay, we've begun to think about those not as just remnants of a former place of the wetlands that used to be New York, but actually as places that we need to own and preserve and maintain and enjoy in a different kind of way. And they're extraordinary places in their own right, and are going to be extremely important in terms of the way that we weather climate change as we go forward. We've also enhanced privately owned public spaces through the POPS program, and DOT and the bids all over the city have brought us new squares and enhanced malls and intersections all over the city. One of my favorite ones, I'm sure you all can visualize, is right around Madison Square, where suddenly Madison Square has been restored and is better maintained, but it's sort of leaked out onto Fifth Avenue and down on Broadway, and suddenly it's a district of open space and places we can reach out. And obviously over the last 18 months, New Yorkers have retaken our streets. We have owned our streets in a way that we never could have envisioned without the pandemic. And I think one of the most important things that we're going to have to think about as we go forward in this city is, what does that trend really mean? We learn to experience our street in a totally different way all across the city, and that gives us extraordinary opportunities. So I'm going to stop there, because I know you want to get to some questions. And but we should talk about climate change and what the pandemic and, frankly, what IDA has meant for the infrastructure and what we build in New York.
Well, Elizabeth, thank you very much. Tom Wright has the toughest job, because he has to figure out a way to make Connecticut, New Jersey, and New York or be a region when the governors aren't always in accord. Yeah. And I think you should appreciate how difficult it is, because the fact is the region is economically integrated. It's integrated by transportation and by many other functions. In fact, we've exported our defeated football teams to New Jersey. Until they win, we won't let them play in New York. So maybe another decade. But
They may be there for a while.
yeah. But Tom is going to talk now, I think, about, I think the question really of the infrastructure, especially, I hope, some of the underground infrastructure, which we take for granted, but which is so crucial to our life.
Sure, I'll talk about the underground infrastructure, although if you'll indulge me for a moment, when Gene mentioned July 4th, 1976 as the day he started his firm, I was reminded of a famous regional story on that day. This is a true story. Governor Brendan Byrne of New Jersey was asked by a reporter on that day if he'd known that 200 years earlier, at the birth of the nation, the governor of New Jersey had been Ben Franklin's illegitimate son, and what did he think had changed over the 200 years since that time? And Brendan apparently kind of thought about it for a moment. He said, I bet it was a lot easier being governor if you just started out as a bastard from the very beginning. So those are the kinds of people I get to deal with. The other, I will say, from a date perspective, and it's really a wonderful pleasure to be here this evening and help celebrate Carlo and the Building Congress. Today is actually my, literally to the day, 20th anniversary of being at RPA. I started my second time here on September 13th, 2001, 2 days after 9/11, and started working on Lower Manhattan and what would happen there. And today I get to work with Elizabeth and Carlo and Ben, and the civic community in New York City is really one of the great resilient infrastructures that the city has. And I would say NYU and our academic institutions and cultural institutions are, I think, why New York keeps coming back and why we learn from and do better each time. And I just want to say congratulations, Carlo and the Building Congress, for everything you guys have done, because you really show us all the way. To talk about underground infrastructure, I promise, Mitch, I'll get to it. But I thought, Gene, as you were showing that slide, that first slide he showed, of course, in my mind, I'm translating that to what was happening during each of those decades underneath the ground. And in many ways, it parallels a certain kind of infrastructure, very much parallels what you're talking about in the built environment. Thank you. And then another kind of infrastructure is the inverse of this. I mean, during those first decades, from 1890 essentially to 1920, what else was happening in New York City? We were building water tunnels, we were building subways, we were building, we were expanding on the commuter rail system and building this extraordinary infrastructure system that was connecting the metropolitan region together and giving us the ability to grow and prosper and improve quality of life for the millions of people who were moving here. And then what happens in that trough year, of course, is we all but completely give up, not just expanding that infrastructure, but even maintaining it. And so we go through that period when the subway systems, and I was a kid on the Upper West Side in the 1970s, and I still tell the young people at RPA, if you think you want to complain about the subways today, you don't have any idea about what it was like. But that was the legacy of that. What was happening during that period? Of course, we were building highways instead, and the entire industry really did shift its focus. At RPA, we've estimated that during individual years during that time, we were building at a peak at about 75, 76 miles of limited access highway every single year over the course of those decades, which kind of was all about moving people out of the city and kind of an anti-urban, anti-New York City ethos. But what's happened now, really since 2000, is we've started to turn the corner and come back. And we have these mega projects. First off, I gotta say, of course, let me back up. It was the MTA and the leadership of the MTA and Dick Ravitch and Bob Kiley and people and the funding of it and just getting those trains to work. And that was the core to anything else happening in New York. There was no way the city could come back with the kind of subway system that it had in 1976. But then from that, now I'm glad that I think that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can maintain the system and improve it and make the kinds of expansions and investments that we're talking about. The Gateway project to build a new tunnel under the Hudson River, second phase of 2nd Avenue subway. We need to keep expanding this system so that we can stay on the path that we want to, which is New York always growing and prospering. And I think that we are moving in the right direction. I'm one of these, I have to be optimistic to stay in this world. And to people who kind of, push back sometimes about, the cost and these projects and it's too ambitious and we can't do it. I just think, again, if you kind of think about what was accomplished in New York from 1900 to 1920, what we're talking about is a tiny addition. And yes, there are other ways we can figure out how to expand on it and other things. But we've got to be able to keep doing this. And I think that the next 10 years is really going to be a great period of time for us. I'm very excited about what's happening around Penn Station, what's happening with the MTA capital plan, what's happening at the Port Authority. We're starting to really see that attitude come back, and I'm optimistic about it. So there, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you. First, I'm going to do this. Carlo and Janine have, been very kind, not giving me instructions, but I want to allow the people in the audience who have questions to first get a chance, because I know there's a limited amount of time. So if there's anyone with a question, I want you to raise your hand. If you have any comments or disagreements, I want to make sure everyone here has an ample opportunity to participate. So, and if you could identify yourself, that'd be great. In the back? Yes.
My name is Kohn. I'm curious, as we face the next 100 years of building in New York City, what might a constant lesson over the last 100 years be in terms as we approach new infrastructure needs, sustainability? Is there a big picture message of everything we've learned since 1920 or 1921 that you think is important to push forward?
Let's take that.
I'm going to take a shot. You know why? Because I think there is one, which is that disasters have been opportunities for New York, that however much they've caused distress and pain and loss, the disasters have, the reason we have a water tunnel is because there was a cholera epidemic in the 19th century. We have subways because of the great blizzards of 1888. There's a great, exhibit upstairs, and Carlo, you did a great job. You have no idea how important it is. The Depression was a disaster for private building, but a great opportunity for public building in New York. And some of the great benefits we have with really the fact that the federal government provided the money, not just for public housing, but for some of the bridges and tunnels and, of course, LaGuardia Airport. So, and today, yesterday, on Saturday, we saw the ceremony for September 11th, but what's amazing is that 20 years later, Lower Manhattan has been reconceived because Eugene had a building, 60 Wall Street, which I remember the old 60 Wall Street, but the point you should know is that if you walk on Wall Street today, it's filled with baby carriages and people walking their dogs. And there are 50,000 people living below Canal Street who didn't live there before September 2001. And whatever else we have done is that people thought no one would ever want to live downtown. Gene gave a great example of the high-rise. I know people say, I'll never work in a high-rise building. Oh my God. And now, this is one of the great stories of, out of that disaster, we rebuilt Lower Manhattan. And out of this pandemic, we're going to find out that the nature of office building is going to change. It has already. You can't have a good office building without a deck or several decks. And one of the great ironies is how quickly the architects have responded to open space. We now have open space at the 80th floor at 3 World Trade Center. We have it at Vanderbilt. I mean, they have it at places that didn't even know they had an opportunity to do it. And I think that one of the opportunities that comes out of this disaster is that there are very few cities that offer face-to-face interaction at the level that New York does. And that just means it's in the parks, it's in the office buildings, in the hotel lobbies. And as everything becomes digital, the places that offer face-to-face are going to be fewer and fewer. And so New York actually has a great advantage because the things we value most will be more difficult, which is interaction. And I actually think if you come to New York, you can do about 8 event interactions in one day. There's no place you can be more productive. Try going to LA and trying to get from 1 hour from Pasadena to Century City, maybe 3 hours. So this disaster may eventually demonstrate our capacity for density is actually our asset.
Yeah. I'll just jump on that because that is, and again, not to minimize the tragedy and what happened in 9/11, but clearly the planning process to bring back Lower Manhattan positioned it better to deal with COVID. I do believe that we created a better district and a more resilient one, and that overall, I mean, one of the things that happened in New York after 9/11 was there was a daily discussion about building and design and planning and construction. Everybody in New York City became a client. There was every single newspaper had a story every single day about who had dinner with whom and who was at. But what came out of that was a kind of a higher attention to quality, detail, and New York City has responded not just in Lower Manhattan, but across the city in terms of the quality of the work that's being done that has made us a stronger and more resilient city. And I think that it's an advantage for us coming out of COVID. And I know that's a tough and difficult thing to say. The only other thing I'll say going back like 100 years is, anytime somebody tells you that there's some new trend that's come along, some new technology or a disease or something else that means the world is flat and people won't want to be together and, no longer need tall buildings or mass transit or any of that, forget about it. It's just a ridiculous thing because I've been through it a couple of times in my career, and I'm sure I'll go through it a couple more times. At the end of the day, human beings love being around other human beings, and the interaction, the creativity, the diversity is our strength. And so keep investing in the subways, keep building buildings, keep doing urbanity because it works. And it's New York City is the greatest invention for human prosperity that I think we have ever invented as a species. And so we got to keep with that. And anytime somebody tells you, oh no, now it's all changed and we'll never go back, I think they're kidding themselves.
Yes. If you just identify yourself, just so I.
Sure. I'm Lisa Bing, and I'm a strategy and leadership expert, so I'm not in your field. Oh, okay. I'm Lisa Bing, a strategy and leadership expert, not an architect or engineer. However, it strikes me as I listen to the various comments, I'm wondering if you can speak to the degree of collaboration across professions and trades and so forth with the open space and the infrastructure and homes to create communities. And are you seeing more? Or is there a change in the need for that level of collaboration going forward?
Sure, I'll start, and then I'm sure all my colleagues here will want to comment on this too. I think there's enormous amounts of collaboration and innovation going on around particular projects. I think the place where we're still missing the glue that we need is really at the big policy level, and how do we implement that? How do we deliver, when we're facing climate change, how do we deliver real change on the ground in every neighborhood in an equitable way? And it's that we haven't gotten there, which is not to say that people aren't doing amazing things to think about those problems, right? But the question is, have we been able to scale it as a city? And I think the answer at the moment, and I am optimistic as Tom is, that we have to get there. We are not there yet. So from a policy perspective, I think that we are missing some of the glue that propels us forward to things that we know we need to achieve. And I think that that is one of the difficult moments. What last week taught us, what Ida taught us, was that we had a crisis in Sandy. We knew what too much water was like. This water came from the same place the other water came, and yet we hadn't figured out how to thread all those problems and imagine the solutions that were going to be necessary and achieve them. And as a result, more people died in New York City and in the region than died in Louisiana and Mississippi. And that is an unacceptable tragedy. I'm sure we all agree about that. So I do think there's enormous amounts of collaboration going on, enormous amounts of innovation and change that's possible. The question is, how do we get it up at the level that we need it so it's truly systemic in New York?
Could I add something to that? I think we have a tremendous amount of integration between all the different disciplines involved in design and construction. If you just look at some of the structures, especially globally, you see these spiraling buildings. It just tells you there was a tremendous integration between the architectural disciplines and the engineering disciplines. And there's a glue that's developed that's holding everything together in our professions, and that's sustainability. Just about every professional involved in the design of a project is contributing to lowering the carbon footprint. So I think it's almost exponential, the amount of integration going on between things. And if I could just add one comment concerning how we respond to disasters, as you and Gene alluded to in a lot of his previous talks, everyone was saying high-rises are over after 9/11. According to the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat, globally, 5 times as many high-rises have been built since 2000 than were built before 2000. And a high-rise is defined as anything over 200 meters.
Gene?
Yeah, I was going to add that what is apparent from this discussion is that we really need to combine what happens below grade, transportation, utilities, et cetera, at grade, open space, parks, and tall buildings, and low buildings, and fat buildings, and thin buildings. I mean, we really need to combine all that, begin to really think about that in total environment point of view. You made some great points, both of you, and it makes me begin to think again that it would be good to trace this history of New York, also below grade, with its transportation, its utilities, to how buildings emerged, and the change in not just the skyline, but the feel of New York, and the excitement of New York.
We're going to all add to your slide, Gene.
So I'm going to ask Robin, do you have a question? Then I'm going to say I want to turn this over to give Carlo a chance to give us a benediction. So, Robin?
I just have one other question. Just thinking about things, thinking about the last 100+ years.
Give her the mic. Give her the mic. Yeah.
Thank you. Just thinking about the last 100+ years, and how many of the projects were done in collaboration with the federal government. And when it came to Hudson Yards and Related wanted to build above the platform and said, we need mass transit, and Bloomberg said, I'll build you the number 7 line. I'll build it, and people will be able to get there, and we'll do it without the federal government. We'll find a way. In other words, we did it on our own. So now we're talking about new projects that are needed for improving the subways, to face COVID, to face IDA, to put our city in a more resilient position. How much of that is really possible for us to do it on our own?
I'll try and take a whack at that. I mean, I'll say, and by the way, on the number 7, there's a story I've heard that might be true, it might be urban myth, but the way I'd heard it was folks in the Bloomberg administration and Dan Doctoroff's office did a little back of the envelope analysis, and they concluded that they could probably get the federal government to pay for 30% of the cost of the 7 extension, but it would cost 3 times as much to get them involved, and so they better just do it on their own. And whether or not they actually did that analysis, I'd feel pretty confident that those numbers would bear out. But we are, I mean, I think part of why you're asking the question is because we're at this moment when we might have this $1.1 trillion federal stimulus bill coming down the pike, and which could open up a new era of partnership with communities. But it's still, I mean, I don't know, this may sound, man bites dog kind of here, but I mean, I'll say I've talked to my friends in Washington on the Hill and stuff and said, so what does this mean for the Gateway project if the bill comes through? And they say, well, it means the federal funding will be there. And I kind of go, well, so what, without it? Like, we don't have, well, we might get it, we might not, kind of thing. But nobody yet has, I think, really figured out that question as to what it would mean. I think that there will be an enormous challenge in the delivery pipeline to plan, engineer, design, finance all of the projects. I kind of hope for a model where the federal government helps those cities and regions that help themselves. I would like to see congestion charging generate, not just $1 billion a year for us, but $1 billion match from the federal government. And I think the feds ought to be looking to use that money in ways to put it that way. But I really do think that's actually, and maybe I'm not supposed to say this publicly, but it's going to be a challenge to figure out just how wisely to use that money and make sure it goes as far as it possibly can.
So I think, first of all, it's a great question, but I just want to say one part. We have one thing. New York has the best investment banking community in the country, probably the only one. And if there's one thing I have faith in, that they can take $1 of federal money and turn it into $10 of borrowed money. And we have to appreciate that the financing of infrastructure has been one of the great success stories of New York. The MTA is the 3rd largest issuer of municipal tax-free debt in the United States. And people don't appreciate the fact that it's not the dollars, it's what we do with the dollars and leveraging. And I think that will be the challenge. There was a question here, and then we're going to go to Carlo.
Stand up. Hi, everyone. My name is Tasnuva Haq. I have joined Kohn less than 2 months ago, so I'm very new in the industry. I have a very quick question regarding Hudson Yards. After the opening of the vessel, it's like a great landmark of New York City, very attractive, everyone goes to visit, but we had to keep it closing for multiple times due to people committing suicide and stuff on that place. Is it something we did not see coming, or what can we take out of this event that even right now the vessel is closed? This is one of the top attractions of the entire Hudson Yards place.
What? Well, it's anyone, but
It's about the vessel, and
I think the problem,
all these deaths.
Richard, yes.
I don't know if the problem's an architectural or structural problem. I think it's maybe a medical or psychological problem.
Can I say that?
Behavioral problem.
If you go back 40 years ago, if you went to San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge was a major venue for suicide. And they took precautions and changed the bridge on the exterior. And I think that this is a case where I think there was inadequate attention to the risks. And I assure you, there's a lot of money being spent now to find a way to control the risks. But I think this is, I have to be careful, but sometimes in well-meaning efforts to make art also do not really have enough attention to the risk. And whenever you do anything with height, there's far more precautions on the observation deck at Hudson Yards than there are at the vessel. So if we could bring the same know-how there, I think you'd find that you have to reduce the opportunities. I hope that's helpful. Let me thank the panelists now.
Thank you.
And I want to thank everyone. You've been great. I want to thank the audience, and I want to thank Carlo for putting this together. Carlo, it's great.
Thank you. Before we go, I'm going to ask a question. What was a mistake that we made in the last 100 years? There are probably thousands of them, but if you could think of one thing that we should have done that we didn't do, and then just end with what's the project of the future? What's the thing we should be focused on for the next 100 years? And I want your answer too, Mr.
Okay, so
I feel like
I'm going to be. This is easy for me. Very simple. We should take the #1 subway, extend it to Red Hook. We could build 50,000 units of housing.
I agree. Dolly's with you on that. I'm with you.
I'm trying to think of a good answer, but one of the things I remember as a boy, I was born in Philadelphia. My mother was a fashion designer and used to take the train to Manhattan to the district where, the best business district, fashion district. And I would go with her. And many times I'd go myself. And I still remember the excitement coming from below grade, rising into that city of New York, and the excitement would just overtake me. Oh, I'm sorry. I was saying that, I apologize. I didn't want you to hear either, since I don't hear. I was saying that as a boy, I grew up in Philadelphia. My mother was a fashion designer, besides being a very good artist. And we used to take the train to New York, and she would take me with her occasionally see the models and the dresses and all that. But the excitement for me was coming up from below the train tracks. And I love trains. And rising into this city of excitement, you felt it instantly. The noise, the excitement, the traffic, the people, the bustle, and I loved it. And I remember I didn't want to lose that feel. It was so special. I liked Philadelphia, but it didn't have that, and despite they had a subway. But for me, New York always was the place of great excitement. I loved the Central Park. I loved to watch kids playing ball in the park or people playing chess. To me, there was an excitement about New York that was very special, and then emphasized by these great buildings that began to rise. I remember my first visit to a tall building. I was so excited to be able to look down and see all this happening. So New York is a phenomenal city, and it can only get better if we all work to make it better. And to me, that's going to be, there are weak moments in the city. There are areas that need help. But there's no question that the potential of this city is to be the greatest city in the world. And with all these wonderful people here who really care and doing a great job, I'm sure it will be.
So I think the biggest mistake was that we built a mass transportation system that didn't imagine that we were ever going to do anything but go into the central city. And that as a result, we are developing extraordinary places and neighborhoods in places that are really, really hard to get to and really hard to get between. So I live in Queens, and I have friends who live in Park Slope, and getting there is a real trial. And I think retrofitting a city when you make a mistake like that is really hard, right? Because our subway infrastructure and our bus infrastructure is really hard to retrofit. But I do think that the future is New York is beginning to have central business districts all over the city. It's beginning to be a city where great education is happening in many places that were unimaginable before, where great parks are happening in places that we never thought we would ever go. And that's true of many other things. So I think sort of thinking how we knit it all together is to correct that mistake in a way that's efficient and equitable and fair is going to be super important as we go forward.
I'll say first I'm 0 for 2 because I was convinced that Elizabeth was going to say tearing down Penn Station was the big mistake. And I knew that Mitch wanted to say that allowing the Giants and the Jets to move to New Jersey was the biggest mistake. So, but they didn't say either of those things. I think that it's like, well, kind of tying on what you said. I mean, I think allowing the subway to fall into disrepair was the biggest mistake we ever made. And I think that the really exciting thing I'm looking forward to is congestion pricing. And over the next year and a half, we're going to be talking about and implementing a policy, the first time in the United States that everybody driving into the central business district will be paying. It has worked phenomenally well in London, in Stockholm, in Singapore. I've been getting calls for the last year and a half from Boston, LA, Chicago, all these places wanting to do it. And I think it's really important that we do it well, and if we do that, we will be kind of repositioning that automobile versus mass transit, and I think that that's a huge opportunity for us, and I'm very, very excited about it.
Well, I would just add to that, thinking more towards the future, that we have to spend more time taking in the past, not throwing away what we've learned in the past, and trying to use the past technologies in an improved manner in the future. One example I would just throw out, we're starting to design and build high-rise buildings, reasonably high-rise buildings, made out of timber. And they can be quite economical and very, very sustainable and contribute to lowering the carbon footprint throughout urban areas.
Thank you. Well, I think that's a great place to stop. Let me thank the panel, our moderator, a big round.